Okay, well, good morning, everyone. My name is David Winter, and I would like to welcome you to this panel on gender, race, and institutional trust in the 2016 election. I should say, if you're looking at the program, that some confusion about the names of Talk 1. Maya's last name is Gobole, not Winter. I would be proud to have you as a relative, but, you know, it just... And the second author is actually Noelle Malvar. Virginia Valian is the third author, and Noelle Valian does not exist. If you could figure out how that happened, perhaps you can figure out the 2016 election. One brief word of introduction to this panel. When I was a sophomore in college and took my first statistics course, one of the assigned readings was a book called The Pre-Election Polls of 1948, a report to the Committee on Analysis of Pre-Election Polls and Forecasts. That was the 48 election where virtually all of the polls were wrong, and the election that produced the wonderful Chicago Tribune headline, "Dewey defeats Truman," which Harry Truman, who was reelected, held up with great glee as his train passed through, I think, Chicago on the way back to Washington, D.C. Well, I suspect the 2016 election is going to generate the same kind of scholarship about what happened and why and how did it happen. The public opinion polling people have already met in New Orleans to discuss what they learned, if anything, and ASAP is, as I understand it, coming out with a special issue. But we're going to preempt them today with a panel on gender, identity, and trust in relationship to that election. I would like to ask that we'll take the papers in order, and I'd like to ask people to hold questions until the end so we can have a maximal time for interactive discussion. The first paper then by Maya Goldmole, Noelle Malvar, and Virginia Valian of the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. I can take care of that.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Winter, for that introduction and the clarification. It's so good to see you all here today.
Wait a minute.
Okay, today my talk is going to be on gender and neutral traits. Who is the ideal president? First, I'd just like to quickly acknowledge my collaborators, the real collaborators, Noelle Malvar and Dr. Virginia Valian from the CUNY Graduate Center. And also a quick acknowledgement to our sponsors with this project, the Gender Equity Project and the Roosevelt Public Policy Institute at Hunter College. So, as you may remember, we had a very historic election on November 8th, 2016. This was between two very highly unprecedented candidates. On one side, we had Hillary Clinton, who was the first woman to be nominated by a major party for president, and who was perhaps overqualified for the position. On the other side, you had Donald Trump, who is an anti-establishment candidate and a businessman with virtually no political experience. In thinking back to November and explaining Hillary Clinton's loss, people even now are quick to cite things like the Comey letter and Wisconsin and a poorly run campaign, and of course, the emails. And there is talk about gender and sexism, but I'm not sure people really know what to do with that information, and people seemed really torn on whether or not they felt that it actually played a role in explaining her loss. So today I'm going to present research to you where we examined a couple things. First, how gender stereotypes about the ideal president, as well as how perceived gender traits of Hillary Clinton, and finally sexism, shaped this past election. Previous research has shown us that gender stereotypes serve descriptive and prescriptive functions. So gender stereotypes tell us how men and women are and how they should be. There's backlash toward women who possess these typically masculine or agentic traits, as well as toward women who try to occupy traditionally masculine roles, for example, CEO. And furthermore, these women with agentic traits, such as assertiveness, are perceived as competent, but they are seen as less likable than similarly behaving men. So these agentic women can be taken seriously. They are seen as competent, but they face that backlash in the form of social penalties. Now, just anecdotally, you can see how this might be very, very relevant to Hillary Clinton in this past election. And in addition to looking at perhaps these perceived agentic traits, we wanted to examine how a lack of feminine traits could have also influenced her favorability. I'm going to address three things today. How do people attribute masculine and feminine stereotypes to the ideal president? To what extent, or how did Clinton and Trump encapsulate these traits of the ideal president? As well as how did they line up with the average man and the average woman? And finally, how did perceptions of gender and sexism shape people's attitudes and favorability toward Clinton and Trump? We conducted a research study on Mechanical Turk in the months prior to the election. And upon recruitment, participants were randomized into one of 5 conditions: the ideal president, the average man, the average woman, Clinton, or Trump. And they were rating these individuals on a list of 64 traits. These traits included stereotypically masculine and feminine traits from the Personal Attributes Questionnaire and the BEM Sex Role Inventory. And participants were shown these traits and had to rate them on a slider scale from 0 to 100 of how typical they were of this individual. And I'll show you what this looks like in a minute. Finally, participants completed the Modern Sexism Scale by swimming colleagues, demographic information, and rated favorability toward Clinton and Trump. Here's an example of what this slider scale looks like. So the participants were shown, remember, you are rating how typical each characteristic is for that individual. In this case, Hillary Clinton. So the bar started in the middle, and they moved it left if they thought it was less typical of that person, and to the right if they thought it was more typical of that person. Of the 64 traits, 22 were stereotypical masculine traits, such as independent and decisive, and there were 16 stereotypical feminine traits, such as kind and warm. And these traits, we created a mean, so there was a composite masculine score and a composite feminine score for each person. Now, because these were all desirable traits, socially desirable, these could be a little bit skewed by their feelings toward the people. So we also asked them, just explicitly, how masculine, how feminine do you think these people are, to get a more neutral perspective. Of our sample, it was 56% female and 78% white. 45% identified as Democrats, 20 as Republicans, and 32% independents. And of the people that indicated that they planned to vote in the 2016 election, 53% said they would vote for Clinton, 29% for Trump, and 18% said that they would vote for some third-party member. Modern sexism was scored on a scale from 1 to 7, with higher amounts indicating higher modern sexism. These include items such as discrimination against women is no longer a problem in the United States, and it is easy to understand the anger of women's groups in America. So this scale is really getting at more subtle biases that permeate within our culture about women, and whether or not people feel as if they have reached equality in the United States. On our scale, the average score was 3.1, which was just below midpoint. However, there were some important group differences. So men were significantly higher than women on this, with 3.5 versus 2.7, indicating that men showed more of this modern sexism. And Republicans were significantly higher than independents and Democrats. Republicans at 4.1 and Democrats at 2.6, with independents falling in the middle. Now here is the gender trait ratings by condition. So I'll talk you through this here. The green bar indicates that composite masculine mean for each individual, and the orange bar represents the composite feminine mean for each individual. The first thing I want to point your attention to is this ideal president bar. People saw masculine traits as more typical of the ideal president than they saw feminine traits, indicating that this role is perhaps a little bit more stereotypically masculine. You can also see here that Clinton and Trump, they were equivalent in their masculine scores to the ideal, but both fell short in their feminine scores. But overall, they both still mirrored this pattern of having more stereotypical masculine traits than feminine traits. The next thing I want to point your attention to is looking at the average woman versus Hillary Clinton. So Hillary Clinton is perceived as significantly less feminine than the average woman and significantly more masculine than the average woman. So you're seeing a total flip here in her gender weightings. So she's really not fitting this norm of the stereotypical woman. Now, when we bring modern sexism into the picture, we see that those who were higher in modern sexism valued feminine traits less in their ideal president. So those that were scoring higher on the scale said that feminine traits were less typical of the ideal. And modern sexism was also associated with decreased favorability for Clinton and increased favorability for Trump, both pretty strong. Now when we zoom in on what's exactly happening with gender and sexism and favorability, we get this graph. So, first thing, these masculine and feminine, this is to take away the desirability. This is just looking at the explicit ratings of masculine and feminine now. So this modern sexism was associated with seeing Clinton as less feminine, though it did not affect how people saw her masculine. And furthermore, her favorability was influenced by her perceived gender traits. So the more masculine she was perceived, the less favorable she was seen, and the more feminine she was perceived, the more favorable. And this relationship with femininity was stronger. So they really here, she was rewarded for fulfilling these traditional female gender traits. So I just want to leave you with a couple points. First, who is the ideal president? Well, the ideal president is significantly more masculine than feminine, or possesses significantly more masculine traits. And this might not be surprising given all our presidents to date have been men. However, Clinton, a female candidate who mirrored these traits of the ideal president, that is, someone who had more masculine traits than feminine traits, was seen as less favorable the more masculine she was seen. So you're seeing that backlash effect here. And also, because she was less feminine than the average woman, she was also penalized, and perhaps even more strongly. So in both ways, she's kind of stuck in this double bind, where she can be masculine like the ideal president, but be seen as less favorable, and also she's not feminine enough for that as compared to the average woman. Modern sexism is associated both with lowered preference for feminine traits in the ideal president, as well as favorability for Clinton. So when people ask if sexism played a role in this election, I would say yes. It influences both how people view the ideal president, what people want in the ideal president, as well as how they explicitly feel about a female candidate. And finally, in line with some previous research, our data suggests that an agentic female candidate who is not feminine enough is penalized, especially by people higher in sexism. So thinking back to this election, yes, the emails and the letter and Wisconsin and the campaign all played a role, But the bigger picture here is sexism and gender. And these perceptions of her gender influenced how she was seen throughout her entire campaign. And really, I think the takeaway here is that people still have a hard time reconciling what it means to be a leader and what it means to be a woman. Thank you.
Okay, our second speaker is Peter Glick from Lawrence University.
Okay, thanks. All right, so there we go. Just a wild hypothesis, like Maya, that maybe sexism and gender had something to do with it. When we start talking about penis size, maybe there's something going on that's gendered, and of course also this notion of Hillary, being the first female president and sort of trying to appeal to an in-group favoritism among women, also was, a hope for a gendered effect, right? So I'm not going to go heavy on theory because I feel like I'm preaching to the choir, right? So if we think about sexism, and of course I'm going to talk about hostile sexism and benevolent sexism, because that's my thing, but modern sexism is very strongly correlated with hostile sexism, although we'll see I have some slightly different results than Maya. So we know that that's associated with negative attitudes toward women who challenge male authority, so obviously that should be a negative for Clinton, but was it also a plus for Trump, right? Because he embodied those attitudes, so that might appeal to hostile sexists. Benevolent sexism should help women in a way, quote unquote help women. All right, all my career has been about how benevolent sexism actually harms women, right? And it's kind of a false promise. So there could be some sympathy to Clinton that might help her, appeal to people high in benevolent sexism because they might feel a little bit protective toward her, but we know that protection is highly contingent on sort of fitting traditional roles, and as Maya pointed out, she didn't fit that traditional femininity, so maybe it simply disappears. What about for Trump, right? I mean, obviously there were certain comments and an Access Hollywood tape that suggested he's highly misogynistic in a gross and overt way. You think that might activate benevolent sexists' protection toward women, and we saw some of this with Republicans saying, oh, I have a daughter, I have a wife, and therefore I can't support Trump. That lasted all of 10 seconds, but so maybe it was a negative for Trump, or again, maybe this is a false promise, right, to women, especially when you challenge male authority. Then just thinking about gender itself, just thinking straightforward in-group bias, right? If there was in-group bias, the gender card. Who played the gender card, right? We heard a lot about the gender card. And so, for women, then that should be a plus for Clinton. For men, that should be a negative. There's in-group bias, and of course, just the reverse for Trump. So that's another thing that I'm going to look at. And I had this opportunity because an editor at Reuters Ipsos polling called me, Thomson Reuters, and said, would you mind if we put some of your ambivalent sexism items in our poll? And I'm like, hell no, of course, put these in, right? When do we get that, that opportunity for these huge nationally representative samples, as David said? I'm not sure how representative sometimes, but this came out right before, during, after the election, so they had these waves of polling data that included ambivalent sexism, a total of 6,000 people, roughly evenly split between women and men, and then they included some 3 items, of course you can't include the whole scale, right? So I got 3 items in there from benevolent sexism and hostile sexism. So these are the 3 items from each of the scales, and of course, hostile sexism is a sort of competitive attitude toward women, that women are trying to gain power over men. That's a bad thing. Benevolent sexism, very different, subjectively positive tone that's patronizing, condescending, but seemingly protective toward women. Again, offer protection, provision, affection toward women who are the quote-unquote right kind of women, right? Women who take on these traditional roles, which is probably not Hillary Clinton Of course, they included a lot of demographics. I didn't have any control over what else was in this, so I would have liked to include other things, but we have what we have. I'm going to focus on favorability ratings, not on voting behavior, because favorability ratings then separate out the candidates. They're not confounded, right? When you have a binary choice, or maybe you have a third candidate, but pretty much is a binary choice, that confounds the attitudes toward each candidate. First off, just thinking about, gender is related to endorsing sexism, right? So typically men score higher in hostile sexism, but that gender gap disappears or is smaller or even reverses in the most sexist nations we found for benevolent sexism. But, and also generally, people endorse benevolent sexism more readily than hostile sexism because it seems a lot nicer, right? So let's challenge that. Well, we found pretty typical kind of thing here, which is men outscored women in hostile sexism. They also outscored women in benevolent sexism, but that gap is much smaller, right? And everything is significant with 6,000 people, right? You know that. 6,000 people. Statistical significance is kind of meaningless here. I'll focus on magnitude of effect. Though some things are not significant. So again, why examine the favorability ratings? So it's not just this forced choice, of course, and they are distinct, right? For men, the favorability ratings were between Clinton and Trump were not that strongly correlated. For women, they were pretty strongly correlated. All right, I'm not sure exactly what that means, but you might have some ideas. But also who you favor, the difference score between the two pretty much predicts voting behavior, right? Who they intended to vote for or who they actually voted for after some of this was taking place after the election. And this held some surprises. So, I certainly thought hostile sexism was going to harm Hillary Clinton, but it turns out that in this sample, which is a large kind of representative sample, it was more so for women that hostile sexism was correlated with negative attitudes toward Hillary Clinton. I have some ideas about this, but it was certainly surprising. These ideas are post hoc. This was a really surprising result. Okay, benevolent sexism, men's benevolent sexism very weakly predicted a little bit of a protective effect toward Hillary Clinton, but as I'll show you, this goes away when we control for the correlation between hostile and benevolent sexism, right? And here's the Trump favorability ratings. Hostile sexism was what I would consider a strong predictor. I know it's 0.3, but when you're predicting elections, that's a big effect, right? So hostile sexism among both men and women, equally strong predictor of Trump favorability. Benevolent sexism, right? There's a positive correlation with Trump favorability, but as I'll show you, that disappears as well. So we have to control for the correlation between hostile and benevolent sexism. I've argued for a long time with Susan Fisk that we've argued together, sorry. We haven't argued with each other. We've argued together. These go hand in hand, right? These are not really conflicted ambivalence, but a supportive ambivalence of, I like these kinds of women who support, men's power, and I dislike women who challenge it. So they work hand in hand, and they typically correlate positively. We found that here, that they had modestly positive correlations, and you get a kind of a cleaner pattern of results when you look at the partial correlation. So now we're controlling for the hostile and benevolent sexism correlation. And what turns out then with Trump and Clinton favorability, is it in there? There you go. Clinton favorability, Trump favorability, right? So hostile sexism now does significantly predict for both men and women, but again, it's much stronger for women. That's a really small correlation among men. So that was just incredibly striking to me, right? That we don't have this hostile sexism Clinton disfavoring correlation, right? Benevolent sexism, when you control for its relation to hostile sexism, again, now, so there is, sorry, this doesn't disappear, there is a little bit of protective, but it's small. Little bit of protection toward Hillary Clinton as a woman in this election that, saw Trump that bitch and other kinds of really nasty things coming out. But again, here's the big picture. Hostile sexism predicted favoring Trump much more strongly, right? The sexists seem to like Trump. And benevolent sexism totally disappears, right? Did he get a penalty, right? Did he get a penalty for all that gross stuff toward women that was so overt and sexualized and everything else? No. Once you control for its relationship to hostile sexism, that's why benevolent sexism initially has some positive correlation with Trump favorability. It's simply because it's correlated with hostile sexism. So it's really, but there's no protective effect here other than in attitudes toward Clinton, and those are relatively small. going through this fast, but I'm still nodding head, so I'm assuming it's good. All right. So what about against other predictors? This is really hard to see, okay? But the point here is that for men, the liberal conservative ideology, that's the big predictor, right? If you said I'm a liberal, I'm a conservative on a 7-point continuum, right? That was the strongest determinant of voting behavior. So that's this with a 0.3 to 0.4 correlation to who you vote for. In terms of Clinton favorability, this is coded more higher scores conservative, so it's disfavoring Clinton. Benevolent sexism was actually a relatively good predictor of some favorability toward Clinton. Again, this is a weak effect, but once you account for conservative liberal ideology, this is all thrown into regression together. All right. Once you account for that, other things don't predict that much. Of course, being a white was a negative for Clinton, right, as opposed to a minority, right? There's a weird effect with age when you throw everything else in, but you can see that the biggest thing, and hostile sexism now, for women is a significant sort of factor, it seems like, but again, not for men, okay? Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Okay, let's go forward, okay? What about for Trump, right? Again, conservatives favor Trump, that's a really strong effect, but the other really strong effect, and so this is again striking, the most striking result, hostile sexists like Trump. It's not surprising, right? But it is a very strong effect. You throw everything else in this poll, like age and minority status, and whether you're straight or not straight, all that education, throw all that in. Income had no effect, right, when you throw everything else in, right? When you partial it all out. So, but hostile sexism remains very strong predictor of Trump favorability. Okay. What about gender? Who played the gender card? Well, as you all know, I think Hillary did not play the gender card successfully, right? She may have tried to deal that card, but that card is not a winner, right? Okay. So if you look at these polling data, just simply looking at gender gaps, there was no gender gap for Clinton, right? So these are favorability ratings. They're averaging out around a little bit above 3, and of course these were 2 not the most popular candidates, right? But you don't get the gender gap for Clinton. Now, obviously, if you break it down by minority status versus white, and married women, right, then you get some effects there and some interactions. But overall, Clinton did not get favored by women. She didn't get an in-group bump. Trump did, right? Trump was favored by men over women, all right? If we look at this correlationally, right, there's the same sort of thing. It's a very significant effect for Trump. It's not the biggest correlation in the world, but again, if anybody played the gender card, it was Trump. If you control for all other predictors, right, so now if I control for everything except hostile and benevolent sexism, then the gender gap does become significant for Clinton, but it's not much, right? And it's actually, this is, when you control for everything, that's still men favoring Clinton, not women, right? Okay, so that's a weird little effect. When you also throw in hostile benevolent sexism, we can see some reduction in the hostile sexism, we can see some reduction in that gender gap. So hostile, what I'm going to show you is hostile sexism is accounting for some of that gender gap, all right? So that's why this correlation reduces when you throw in hostile and benevolent sexism. So I'm just going to report betas here, but basically responded gender was modestly but significantly correlated with Trump favoring, and it was also correlated with hostile sexism, right? So I'm quoting men high here. And hostile sexism did predict Trump favorability. And when you throw in, when you control for hostile sexism, the respondent gender correlation drops significantly, but doesn't completely disappear, right? Okay, so there's some partial mediation going on here. Okay, so my conclusion is that, sexism and gender helped Trump more than it hindered Clinton, although I have some caveats on that, okay, right? And it seemed that hostile sexism, to the extent that it harmed Clinton directly, it was more among women than men. So I think that's a really interesting effect to think about. It certainly helped Trump, okay? And hostile sexism when you throw everything I had access to, hostile sexism was the strongest predictor, other than liberal conservative ideology, of favoring Trump. So that is a huge factor in what got Trump elected, it seems to me. Benevolent sexism, very limited protective effect for Clinton, trivial compared to the effect of hostile sexism for Trump, and it didn't harm Trump. So this protection, like this idea that, oh, we have to reject Trump because of his attacks on women, again, that sort of disappeared in the wash a little bit after the Access Hollywood tape was processed by people. Trump played the gender card, if anybody did, because there was this male preference for Trump, and hostile sexism partially mediated that gender gap in favor of Trump. Okay? So there's some caveats, right? I mean, the optimistic way to look at this is hostile sexism may not prohibit men from voting for women, right? There was no correlation, right? So, but it might make them attracted to a hostile sexist male candidate, right? But I think that what we know about backlash, and Maya talked about backlash, we know that backlash occurs even for people who are not explicitly sexist, right? So it may be that hostile sexism is not capturing that Clinton was sort of unpopular, you know, and had this backlash among women as well as men who were not necessarily overtly hostile sexist. So how do we increase women's chances? It would be nice to reduce hostile sexism, right? And increase female solidarity in voting, and then maybe the gender card might flip in favor of somebody besides Trump.
Our third talk is by Blankenship from the University of Michigan.
Thanks, David, and thank you to everyone for being here. It's been exciting to see other work related to the election, and as we can see by the number of people in the audience, everyone is very interested in what's going on. So today I'm going to be talking about identity centrality and institutional trust and how related to the 2016 U.S. election. Here we go. This is an overview of what I'll be going through today, but first I'd like to focus on the 2016 election. And specifically, as we were talking about before, the election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And there's a lot of descriptors that have been thrown out about the election and a lot of things people were saying leading up to it, during, and then after. And one of the things that has been said a lot is about how unprecedented the election was. In fact, one of the previous presenters used it as a descriptor when she was describing the election. And we can all probably think about a lot of reasons why we think this election was unprecedented. And in fact, as a Google search term, the word unprecedented reached its highest point since it has been measured in 2004 during the months of the 2016 presidential election. So it was obviously a word that was in the air. And there's a lot of reasons why we can think this might be. First and foremost, it was the first time a woman had been nominated for a major party candidate. We all talked about various things that Trump said that were his apparent sexist behavior, and this was used as a point of attack by the Democrats. There was a lot of class-based rhetoric on both sides, particularly during the primaries when we had Bernie Sanders as a candidate for the Democrats. There was a lot of race-based talk on both sides, as well as some anti-science and anti-fact sentiment that was voiced on the right, kind of the alternative facts that we've been hearing about. A lot of targeting of the media as being fake news, and then anti-establishment sentiment on both sides. So both sides saying that there were issues with the political establishment as it currently stood. So when I was thinking about all these different factors, I was trying to think of psychological variables that might be a proxy for these and might have influenced people's decision for the 2016 election when they were deciding to vote for. And these made me think of centrality variables, so how important a person's identity is to their sense of self, as well as trust variables, so how much they see an institution as fulfilling their needs and being trustworthy. So for my overarching question for this talk, I was interested in looking at how these different factors predicted voting in the 2016 election, as well as retrospective voting in 2008 and 2012. And I hypothesized that all of these factors would play a stronger role in 2016, given all the things that we talked about before. So as I mentioned, the two main factors I'm looking at are identity centrality, so how important a particular identity is to one's self-worth, or sense of self, and institutional trust, how much an institution serves the interests of the public as well as does the ethical right thing. So today I will be talking about race, class, and gender, and as well as trust in science, trust in the media, and trust in government. As I mentioned, I was interested in seeing how things predicted in relation to their retrospective voting in 2008 and 2012, which were the elections between Obama and McCain and Obama and Mitt Romney. So in terms of methods, we created a sample on MTurk, which consisted of 357 registered voters in the US. The majority were men and white. We had a good mix of class, and then the majority were also straight. In terms of political party affiliation, a large majority identified as Democrat, followed by Independent and Republicans, and then the other parties. So in terms of the procedure, this was part of a larger longitudinal study that took place with a number of collaborators at the University of Michigan. And this longitudinal study spanned from before the election, so right after the conventions, to the inauguration. And today I'll be talking about the waves that happened before the election, so waves 1 and wave 2, as well as wave 3, which happened right after the election. They received compensation for completing each wave, and they received greater compensation for completing consecutive waves, and participants were only allowed to participate in consecutive waves if they had done the previous wave. So this was our retention. We had a fairly steep drop-off from wave 1 to wave 2, as is typical with these longitudinal studies, and it stayed fairly consistent moving forward. This is just an overview of when the waves took place. So as I said, wave 1 took place, before the conventions, wave 2 after the conventions and before the debates, and then wave 3 was immediately after the vote. For identity centrality, we adapted the collective self-esteem scale to include measures for race, class, and gender. And these included items such as how important is your racial, gender, or class identity. These were on a 1 to 7 Likert scale, and all of them had adequate reliability. For institutional trust, we borrowed measures from the American National Election Study from 2012, and we had questions such as how often can you feel you trust the federal government to do what is right? For trust in government. For trust in media, we had a single item. How much of the time do you think you can trust the media to report fairly? And then for trust in science, we had questions such as we cannot trust scientists to consider ideas that contradict their own. And all of these had adequate reliability. For voting behavior, we asked them to, in wave 3, to identify who they voted for in the 2016 election. They had the major party candidates, so Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, as well as the Libertarian and Green Party candidates, and a fill-in option. For 2008-2012, they had the major party candidates and a fill-in option. For this study, we only looked at people who voted for major party candidates across all 3 elections. So that'd be fine. So first off, as you can see, people are fairly consistent across elections, as you can imagine. There was a slight increase in the number of people that voted for Republicans and a slight decrease in Democrats, and 30-party candidates also increased as well. As I mentioned, results moving forward will only look at the major party candidates. So to analyze the voting behavior data, we use logistic regressions, and we use the different factors in these logistic regressions to predict voting. And just to give you a sense for what these tables are showing, so if it shows the candidate and their color, that means that that factor is predicting voting for that candidate. And the number in the parenthesis is the odds ratio. So larger numbers indicate a greater likelihood to vote for Trump. Lower numbers indicate a greater likelihood to vote for Clinton. And basically it's the change in the odds with everything else held constant with the one increase change in the predictor. So as you can see from just looking at the demographics, race was predictive of voting for Democrats, where URMs were more likely to vote for the Democratic candidate. In terms of gender, we found that in 2016, women were more likely to vote for Clinton than men. When we plugged in the identity centrality measures, we found that racial centrality was significant across all three elections. So it was predictive for whites to be more likely to vote for the Republican candidate than underrepresented minorities. Interestingly enough, we did not find a gender centrality or a class centrality effect as we were expecting. So since we found these different effects of demographics and centrality, we wanted to see what would happen if we plugged in the interactions between the demographics and the corresponding centrality measure. So when we did this, interestingly, the race centrality fell out, and we did get a gender centrality effect, such that men were much more likely to vote for Trump than for Clinton. This was the effect across the sample, and then when we pulled out just the men, we found that they were the ones driving this effect. And then we also found a gender by gender centrality interaction, such that men who had higher gender centrality were more likely to vote for Trump, and women who had higher gender centrality were more likely to vote for Clinton. So then we wanted to look at the institutional trust measures, and we did find a lot of interesting effects there. So across all three elections, we found that trust in media and trust in science were predictive of voting for the Democrat. So higher trust in these institutions indicated higher likelihood to vote for the Democratic candidate, and there was a small trend in 2008-2012 for trust in government. And then when we wanted to look at the relative effects of these centrality measures with the trust measures in the same regression, we found that the racial centrality effect went away, and then the trust in media and trust in science effects remained. So just to leave you with some conclusions. So we were interested in, as I said before, how these different things we're talking about as predictive for the election may have played out differently in 2016 versus 2008-2012. Interestingly, we found that trust in science and trust in media across all three elections seemed to predict a lower likelihood to vote for Republicans. While racial centrality in a predominantly white sample did predict lower likelihood to vote for Republicans, higher likelihood to vote for Republicans, this effect disappeared once the trust measures were added. And then, as I said before, gender centrality was predictive of the vote when the other variables were held constant. And this was particularly true in 2016, where we found that interaction effect. So there's been a lot of rhetoric about Trump being the anti-fact candidate. And I think that one of the findings that this study can push against is that maybe we're giving Trump a little bit too much credit for this, and that what might actually be happening is that this distrust in science and distrust in media has long been a part of the Republican voting bloc, and that it's something that we need to take seriously if we're going to appeal to those candidates down the road, and that might not necessarily be just a Trump thing. So in terms of limitations, I have a few that I'd like to talk about. First and foremost, this was a correlational design, so we can't infer causation. Also, since the voting behaviors were taken retrospectively, so we gathered their 2008-2012 voting behaviors in 2016. This limits our ability to make any causal claims about predictability. It is possible as well that some of these measures, such as identity, centrality, and trust, may have changed over time. So it is something as an important limitation to consider. In addition, we use the identity centrality measures for both privileged and minority groups, marginalized groups. So it's important to consider the ways in which these centrality measures might act differently with, say, a white participant versus an underrepresented minority participant for future studies. So speaking of future studies, future directions, we should look at larger samples of third-party candidates. As I showed in the previous, one of the previous graphs, interest, at least in voting for third-party candidates, was at its highest, at least in our sample, in 2016. So it is important to think about the factors that might be contributing to voting for these individuals and how political institutions can make sense of this type of voting bloc. Longer-term longitudinal studies should also follow participants over longer periods of time so that we can make better claims about how their voting behavior is predictive across voting. And then other identity factors would also be important to consider. We're actually looking at some of these right now, such as private regard or how positive or negative people feel about their identities. And before I end, I'd just like to acknowledge a few people, many of them in the room. First, I'd like to thank my advisor, Stewart, for letting us do this project, and it has proved to be very interesting and very fruitful. I'd like to thank my collaborators, Eske Savage and Jennifer Frederick, for their support in putting together this project. It's been great working with both of them. And then I'd also like to thank the Gender and Personality Context Lab for their feedback, my undergraduate RAs for helping with the data cleaning, and of course the participants. Thank you.
And our final paper is by Alexandra Weis, who will read or present, along with Alyssa Zucker, Laura Richman, and Leighton Durham from the University of Florida.
Hello everyone, my name is Alexandra, and I'm going to be talking to you today about, predictably, sexism and the 2016 presidential election. So we wanted to take advantage of the opportunity to do a pre-post election study in this historic election where it looked like a woman might be elected. So utilizing previous research from Clinton's first presidential campaign, we knew that sexism in the media rhetoric operated in these overt and subtle ways. And we could see that continuing to happen in this election cycle, particularly as Clinton made it through the primaries. We also knew from the 2008 election that views about race were affected. After Obama was elected, participants in this study, they reported that they thought racial discrimination wasn't really as big a deal anymore, and this happened in a very short span of time, right before and after the election, so we knew that there was the potential to see this change very quickly, where people see a member of a marginalized group get elected and they think, oh, maybe this group isn't so marginalized anymore. So we kind of assumed if Clinton's going to win, and again, you know, we thought she was going to win, gendered attitudes were going to change. So obviously this election was a little bit different than the 2008 election. Gender representation was emphasized throughout the election cycle for both candidates, and I think we've talked about that in a couple of the presentations so far, but again, we did see plenty of this kind of thing in the media, and I'm sure you all did too. Because Clinton's gender presentation was not exactly typical. She was powerful, serious, confident, unsentimental, opinionated. We thought a Clinton win might have been a stand against hegemonic femininity, right? So traditional enforced femininity. It could have communicated to women that they didn't need to conform so much to these traditional feminine norms in order to be accepted or successful. Trump, on the other hand, was stereotypically masculine. He was aggressive and overbearing, and confident and stubborn and loud, and tough, and so on. So if he won, this could have been a validation of hegemonic masculinity, more so than we've ever seen before. So, to be more specific here, remember that this is all longitudinal data, so we're comparing attitudes before and after the election. If Clinton won, we expected that Democratic women would place less value in conforming to feminine norms because they would see that they're not so necessary for success. And they'd report greater collective self-esteem because they would be proud of their gender's accomplishments. But we also expected that Republicans, as a backlash to the results, might endorse more sexist beliefs while devaluing the prevalence of sexism. But if Trump won, we expected that Republican men would have greater collective self-esteem and that they would place greater value in conforming to masculine norms, since it worked so well for Trump. We also thought the Democrats might endorse fewer sexist beliefs as a backlash against the results of the election. So to collect this data, we did a wave about a week before the election and then resurveyed the same people in the 2 weeks following the election. Our participants were recruited primarily through Prolific Academic, which is a crowdsourcing website specifically made for academic research. We chose it because it offers lots of pre-collected demographic information. We could get roughly equal samples of Democrats and Republicans and women and men without having to do a pre-screening survey. And they have an ethical minimum wage. But we did also get some people from Amazon Mechanical Turk. And here are the measures we used. These scales, the conformity to feminine norms inventory and the conformity to masculine norms inventory, are comprised of a bunch of subscales about different aspects of gender conformity. So a few of the feminine subscales conveying these norms are thinness, investment in children and relationships, modesty, etc. For masculine norms, some subscales are like emotional control or power over women or importance of work. The collective self-esteem scale was kind of just gone over in the previous presentation, so I don't need to talk about it too much, but it measures the degree to which you feel like an important member of your group and the degree to which your group is important to your identity and the social image of your group. And obviously, we tailored these items to be specifically about gender for this. Then we used the Ambivalent Sexism inventory, which I also don't need to talk about because Peter Glick just talked about it himself. So anyway, it is important to mention that there's the hostile and benevolent subscales because we also used this behavioral willingness questionnaire, which we developed to focus on everyday sexist situations in which people could intervene in their real lives. And we did make some items that were benevolent and some that were hostile. I'd also like to note that we did have a few other measures that we wanted to test if Clinton won, because we thought she was going to win. But that had to do with self-efficacy and related constructs, but she didn't, and so I'm not really going to talk about that today. Here's the breakdown of our participants. They're all Americans, obviously. Let's see. And here are some preliminary comparisons to give you an idea of what's going on in our sample. You can see the different groups. Hopefully I've made it obvious enough here. Female Democrats, female Republicans, male Democrats, male Republicans, and the same thing over here. They are compared on the Ambivalent Sexism inventory and on the Conformity to Feminine Norms inventory and the Conformity to Masculine Norms inventory, respectively. I will note that this pattern looked basically the same when we separated it out into subscales. So just to make it easier to look at, here the whole thing is. In general, you can see that women reported more gender conformity than did men, and Democrats reported less sexist beliefs than did Republicans. So this does set the stage for our analyses, which here they are. We ran paired t-tests in order to look at these pre-post-election changes. For the women, most of the variables we looked at did not change at all. Here's a couple that did. These are subscales of the Conformity to Feminine Norms inventory. Democratic women appeared to be less invested in romantic relationships after the election compared to what they were before the election. Make of that what you will, I don't know. And Republican women were more invested in modesty after the election. So, you know. Here, more things did happen with men. Here are the Democrats. After the election, they were more willing to intervene in everyday sexist situations, particularly situations that involved benevolent sexism. They also reported less benevolent sexist beliefs, a little bit, and lower collective self-esteem. You know, as an aside, what's interesting is that when analyzed by voting behavior, Democratic men and men who voted for Clinton are basically the same, except that the entire ambivalent sexism inventory did reach significance for Clinton voters, and the change was larger. So here you can see Republican men. After the election, they reported more conformity to masculine norms compared to before the election. Specifically, so this is the whole scale, but specifically there were changes in these subscales, most of all, which are the emotional control subscale, power over women subscale, and the heterosexual self-presentation subscale. So, our findings were pretty unexpected. What's going on? Well, in terms of our preliminary analyses, you're probably not surprised because of what other people have reported today, and because, you know, of these poll results that validate that, you know, men, Republicans, and Trump voters were more sexist overall than women, Democrats, and Clinton voters. However, as for our other results, we couldn't really expect a direct parallel anymore to the 2008 election because of the outcome of this one. So we thought Clinton would win, and there would be changes in women's attitudes about gendered issues as a result of, you know, shifting attitudes about women as capable politicians for whom sexism maybe isn't so much of an obstacle anymore. The fact that women didn't have much of a reaction in the immediate aftermath of what did happen maybe implies that this is just kind of a continuation of the status quo for women in politics. But who knows? So instead of following the patterns we expected, our results could speak to an unfamiliar and polarized political climate in some ways. The way we see it is this. In our sample, there were two paths for the men in response to the election. Either they could you know, deepen their allyship, or they could become a bit more entrenched in a patriarchal ideology. The men who were already somewhat liberal, Democrats and Clinton voters, they tended to follow this path here. Overall, their sexist beliefs lowered a little bit. They distanced themselves from Trump's brand of manhood, and they were more willing to stand up for female friends, colleagues, and acquaintances in these everyday sexist situations. It seemed that they became more aware specifically of benevolent sexism, which maybe is important because they were already a little bit more aware of hostile sexism to begin with, but perhaps, you know, this allowed an opportunity for them to see more subtle things in action as well. Conservative men, on the other hand, placed more importance in conforming to masculine norms, particularly in some of the masculine norms that could be considered toxic or hegemonic masculinity. Compared to their liberal counterparts, they also had more sexist beliefs and they were less willing to stand up against sexism, so, there's that. Our changes were small, but they were also fast. So they may indicate that the political climate can embolden and polarize beliefs in a pretty short amount of time. Some scholars have suggested that Republicans deploy traditional masculinity, especially during these tumultuous times, in order to, gain trust and stabilize their demographic. And I think that also kind of speaks to some of the earlier presentations. And if you went to Ludwig Molina's talk yesterday, you know that masculinity is seen as more American. So when Republican politicians appeal to nationalism, they may also be appealing to masculinity. We also see the potential for allyship, however. Men make good allies because they're taken more seriously when they confront sexism, both by male perpetrators and by women victims. They're just not typically as skilled at recognizing more subtle types of sexism. So our results about benevolent sexism give us hope that this could continue to improve as time goes on, perhaps. So, maybe we could look for a longer longitudinal data to see if this kind of effect is lasting or not, and if it truly is an opportunity to sort of deepen these kinds of allies.
Well, I'm sure I speak for all of you in extending our thanks to all of the panelists for an extraordinarily interesting and topical and relevant and exciting and kind of integrative series of presentations. We do have some time for questions. I wanted to just make a couple of very quick thoughts. Trump seems to have benefited from hostile sexism through his presentation of a kind of hyper-masculine image. I'm wondering whether that truth that has emerged in all of the presentations might also explain his extraordinary performance, surprising to many, in the primaries. Then the other thing is the notion that this election shouldn't be seen as a surprise. It was a long time brewing. The notion of trust and distrusting facts, I wonder if that can be traced back at least to the 2008 economic crash and the globalization effects, alleged globalization effects. We know from other studies that stress, year by year, predicts selecting the tough, macho male candidate, and that goes back a couple hundred years in American history, and there's data on that. So if Trump is a bully, for many of his voters, he's our vote. He's our bully. It's not my bully. He's our bully. And so they got what they wanted and have become more entrenched, perhaps, in their preferences and in the situation that they're in. Those are just some thoughts I have. We have some time for questions. What are your thoughts? Yes?
Yeah, just a question or comment. I know what's happening when the organizers of this conference. At 2, there's a town hall meeting on a lot of these same topics, and it should be a fun conversation. It's going to be a little bit of a data blitz, but a little bit more interactive as well, and I encourage everyone to show up. It didn't quite make the program, and that's my fault, so I thought I'd let you all know.
2 o'clock and where?
I think here.
Here.
Yeah.
Okay. A data blitz. Wow.
Well, not quite a data blitz. It's a a town hall. Wow.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
I had a question for Glenn.
Yes.
I found it very interesting / strange that class was not a predictor, especially since I would think that it would correlate the most with trust for science media and government.
Mhm.
But how do you explain that, I guess?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. I think that part of the reason why it might not have been predictive is because of how much both sides were talking so much about class. So there were class arguments being made on both the Democrats, as I mentioned, with Bernie Sanders, and Trump was somehow throwing together class arguments. So I think part of the reason why we might not have seen it is because like people of different classes, especially the lower classes in our sample, might have been split, based on the rhetoric on both sides.
Yes.
First of all, thank you. This is a fantastic panel. Very interesting. My question is for Dr. Glick and Neil, when on the panel, feel free to chime in if you have something. But I'm interested in this idea of sexism not hurting Clinton, more helping Trump.
Yeah, right.
And I'm thinking about how in the wake of the election, we saw an increase in hate crimes and discrimination around the country, and very often these perpetrators would scream, "Go Trump," while they're doing this problematic stuff. And I'm thinking about how they didn't need to say, that women are awful or minorities are bad. Their support for Trump is the proxy, right? Like, so if I support them, I don't have to say it.
Right.
Do you think that is part of what you see in the data?
Yeah, I think that's a really good analysis, and I think Matt, it's hard to pin it in those data really, but I do think it's related to this whole sort of notion that is very prevalent among, I think, hostile sexist white males, right? That things have shifted in this direction, and I think we saw this with Obama as well, the same sort of phenomenon that this notion now among a certain segment of the population that discrimination against whites and men is now higher than discrimination against women and minorities, right? That is this huge shift, and I think, I don't want to blame Obama or Clinton for that shift, and I think it was brewing in a lot of ways in the society anyway, but those were like prominent examples of challenge to this power. Whenever you have challenge to power, you have backlash, right? And I think that particular backlash was exactly the kind of thing you're saying, that Trump is our bully, our champion, who's standing up and speaking this truth that has been suppressed, that really it's the white man who is now being trodden down. And I'm sure that's rooted in economic conditions as well and all sorts of other things, but I think that that's really kind of where that's partly coming from, or mostly coming from.
I just want to follow up on that, because I think your question raises a really interesting point that maybe only Ben's data would allow us a little bit to look at, but it's the intersection of gender, race, and class. And in some ways, I really think, in terms of Alexandra's findings, I think Trump is doing us an odd favor in some way as women, and as white women in particular, who have awakened in a new kind of way to the racism that Obama was treated to and that the country was treated to, and to these intersectional issues that African Americans and people of color have been aware of for millennia. And so that these analyses, I think, are challenged to think through how do we think about these issues in a more intersectional way, because although I think the findings are really damning of us as white women, there's much more complex ways that we have to think about how to challenge this if we really want to move forward. So I really also appreciate the analyses, and I think they are a great framework